93% of Americans have some marker for metabolic syndrome. These articles on metabolically healthy obese, it doesn't talk about body composition and it doesn't talk about hormonal health. I disavow all of that research because it's based on a ridiculous criteria.
Our guest is Dr. Jonny Bowden. He's a board-certified nutritionist, a member of the faculty of Functional Medicine Coaching Academy, and a nationally known expert on weight loss and healthy aging. And he's the author of several mega hit best-selling books. He's back here on the Model Health Show to share his wisdom with us. It is my great pleasure and my honor to have my friend, Dr. Jonny Bowden, back on the Model Health Show. How you doing today?
I feel the exact same way. It is my great honor to be here. I appreciate you having me, man.
Let's go. Well,
my favorite interview to do.
You sparked something for me that I really took the time to kind of dig into, and it's this new classification, really, in our society, and it's gaining more and more traction. It's this classification of being metabolically healthy obese. And I'd love if you can unpack what that is and why there is some probable flaws in this classification.
Yeah. Well, that opens up a can of worms because I think it's hard to talk about the metabolically healthy obese, MHO, they call it. It's an actual thing. It's an actual classification. I brought the Scientific American paper that actually talks about the Ozempic drugs and all of that. And there's a very good article about the research on metabolically healthy obese people. So I want to, before we get into that, talk about the fat acceptance movement in general. You and I'm going to speak for you on this as well. We believe everybody should be accepted. Nobody should be shamed for anything, for their sexual orientation. I don't care what gender they want to be. I don't care what size they are. Everybody has the right and should expect to be treated with respect as they are. So I am not into fat shaming. I've said that my entire career. That said, we have to find a way to talk about obesity as a condition that statistically increases the risk of just about every chronic disease you can think of. The statistics are frightening. You look at diabetics, they're 60% more likely to die of heart disease than if you're not diabetic. I made prediabetes a crusade when we wrote the most recent edition of The Great Cholesterol Myth. A great deal of that book was on insulin resistance, which is nothing more than prediabetes, which is an epidemic in this country. And the things that it leads to are disastrous. So we wouldn't say if somebody had high blood pressure, oh, let's just accept that and do nothing about it. Of course, that person deserves respect and honor and doesn't deserve to be shamed. But you got high blood pressure, man. That's a serious risk factor. And you can't just ignore that in the spirit of like everybody's cool and kumbaya. So we have to find a way to talk about this without putting any shame on people who have this condition. And you are more than just your obesity. Of course you are. You're a person who has that diagnosis, but let's not be blinded to what it actually does to us. And it shortens our lives in many different ways. And I think that's important to say to begin with. Now, when they talk about, oh, it's perfectly possible to be obese and metabolically healthy, look at the research. I brought it along. How are you defining metabolic health? So they use three things. Blood pressure is under control. That's a very good, I like that one. I have had high blood pressure and it's now under control. And I know how serious a risk factor that is, and I don't want it. So blood pressure is number one. Hip to waist ratio is number two. You have a waist over 40, if you're a man, major risk factors. If you have a waist over 35 for a woman, major risk factors. Those are just facts. There are tons of statistics. I didn't bring them with me because anybody can go to AI, go to ChatGPT and ask for the numbers. They are frightening. So those are two good ones. Here's the third one, which invalidates all the research as far as I'm concerned. You don't have a diagnosis of diabetes. Let's talk about that for a second. So the way we diagnose diabetes is with a measurement called hemoglobin A1C, or just A1C. A1C is a long-range measure of blood sugar. So when you get a glucose test, a fasting glucose test, doctor says it's 90, that's great. It's 110, it's a little high. That's great, but that's just a digital snapshot of where your blood sugar is at that moment in time. The A1C measurement kind of averages it over 3 months. And it's measured in tenths of a percent. So, for example, a 5.0 A1C, you're not even close to diabetes. You're doing great. 5.1, 5.2. Starts to move up to 5.5, 5.7, you're in prediabetes. That's when you get prediabetes. Goes up a little more, 5.8, 5.9, 6.3, 6.4, diabetes. So these are tenths of a percent. They matter a great deal. In our country, we used to say that 88% of people, and this is University of North Carolina research, you can Google 88% of America not metabolically healthy. That research will come up all over the place, except it's no longer accurate. You know what it is now? 93. 93% of Americans have some marker for metabolic syndrome, for prediabetes. So if you've got 5.3, you don't have prediabetes yet. You have 5.5, you don't have prediabetes yet. You have 5.7, you have prediabetes. You still don't have diabetes. So what they're saying is that we're defining metabolically healthy as under 6.4. Mm-hmm. Dude, we have an epidemic of insulin resistance, of prediabetes. 93% of us are metabolically unhealthy because we have numbers in the 5.7, 5.8, 5.9 range. That's not diabetes yet, but it's on its way. And guess what? That never gets better on its own. So if you have 5.7 now and you're escaping a diabetes, guaranteed by next year, if you're not doing anything, it's going to be 5.8, 5.9, 5, and you're going to wind up with diabetes. You are not metabolically healthy. I disavow all of that research because it's based on a ridiculous criteria.
Yeah.
Don't have diabetes. But if you're 0.1% away, you're fine. You're not fine. And I think it's really important that people know that. So even with that flawed criteria, it's only 6%. And I believe that 6% is a transitory phase. Right now, they don't have diabetes. Right now, everything's under control, but it's really not. It's creeping up there, and you're probably a year away from a diagnosis. Yeah. So I don't accept that is metabolically healthy at all.
Yeah. You just mentioned the lower end of the spectrum with this metabolically healthy obesity, right, or MHO as they abbreviate it, being 6% of the population. There's some data that they're pointing out that's upwards of 40, 50, 60%.
It's not true.
Of people with obesity could be metabolically healthy, right? So, and it dependent on which metrics they were looking at, right?
Exactly
and so what I found really interesting about this paper was, they put together some really great graphs. So you could see things in this kind of graphic form. And you'll see when they're looking at all these proper criteria, hip to waist ratio, as you mentioned, blood sugar, blood pressure, all these things, there's a tiny fraction of people that could be considered metabolically healthy obese, right? But as soon as they removed, and they made a special category, as soon as they removed waist measurement, for example, as soon as they removed that one, that number grew so rapidly, right? They just said, let's just throw this out.
Yeah, you take the criteria away, everybody's metabolically healthy.
And the question should be, with that waist measurement, what is that indicative of, right? You gave us some barometers of that. What we're looking at specifically is the type of fat that you're starting to accumulate.
And where it is.
Right.
Because we've always heard, you and I have heard in personal training school, the apple shape versus the pear shape. Well, there's real truth to that. The apple shape is your weight is in the abdominal area. And that is one of the criteria for metabolic syndrome, abdominal obesity, 35-inch waist for women, 40-inch waist for men. That is the most metabolically active fat. That's the fat on your hips and thighs is annoying, and we all hate it. We don't like how it looks, but it's not dangerous. The fat around your belly is dangerous. That fat doesn't just sit there on your hips the way we used to think back in personal training when I started at Equinox. Oh, it's just, annoying fat. It just sits there on your hips. We got to get rid of it. No, those are little endocrine units, organs, those fat cells, and they release things. And one of the things that they release is inflammatory cytokines. So you got interleukin-6, you got all of these inflammatory compounds that are being released by the fat cells. They're not just sitting there. They're making you inflamed. And inflammation is one of the key things to heart disease. It accompanies or promotes or increases virtually every disease you can think of. Inflammation and oxidative stress. So you're an inflammation factory if you've got a lot of fat cells. I mean, that's just what the fat cells do. And it's hard to think that that's a really healthy state for the human body to be in.
Yeah. I love that. That's a great analogy, inflammation factory.
It
and
is.
It's like, and the crazy thing about the article, they're also pointing out the dysfunction that happens with the fat cell. Like they even give these little pictures of it, and you see what happens when the fat cell becomes overstressed.
Yes.
But that part of the equation is minimized. So you just kind of start, as you just mentioned, becoming an inflammation factory in these inflammatory cytokines, which this is where we are in science right now. This is really that underlying culprit when we're talking about the additional risk for all these other diseases, cancer, diabetes, Alzheimer's, the list goes on and on.
What about Alzheimer's? Type 3 diabetes, for God's sake. They call it that for a reason. Because insulin resistance and the inability to use insulin in the body and to get sugar back into the muscle cells, that inability underlines almost every chronic disease, and it certainly underlines Alzheimer's, which is why they now have this category. The World Health Organization finally made a category. And we used to call it Syndrome X. Then we called it Metabolic Syndrome. Then, right? It's now called Cardiometabolic Syndrome. And it has to do with insulin resistance.
Yeah.
So this is as far as I'm concerned, when we rewrote, like I said, the great cholesterol myth, we spent so much time on insulin resistance because it underlies all of this stuff. And people, the doctors are telling, oh, Mrs. Jones, your cholesterol is fine. No, this shows up 10 years before your cholesterol goes up, before your A1C goes up. Insulin resistance can be detected. It can be treated. It can be reversed. It can be prevented with diet, fasting, and lifestyle. And nobody is talking about, and certainly not mainstream medicine is not talking about insulin resistance. Most doctors don't. When I wear a continuous glucose monitor, as many high performance people do, because we want to know, that's so important to know. You go to a regular doctor and ask for a prescription for one of these things, and they'll say, why? You're diabetic? That's only diabetics need that. That's how much they know about this. Nothing. Nothing.
I love that you said
frustrating.
This conversation up by really being clear on this isn't about discrimination. This isn't about
at all, dude. We got to make that clear, because this is not fat shaming. This is not like, you got a condition. We have to talk about it.
Now, the biggest problem that I have with a paper like this and trying to, reclassify kind of a blatant condition or a symptom that can point us to, like, we need to make some changes, is that we're condensing human health into these really pithy boxes. We're so dynamic. We have so many different incredible aspects of us and human health. And with that being said, even the small number of things that can classify somebody as metabolically healthy or unhealthy, these are great things to know. Again, blood sugar, blood pressure, hip to waist ratio, great things. But for example, if you might pass the test with those things, the litmus test, and you're considered metabolically healthy obese, what about the health of your microbiome that could be leading to some dysfunction with how your body is metabolizing and processing your food and fat? What if it's a thyroid condition that is underlying your symptoms of obesity? What if it's an issue with hypothalamic inflammation, right? So researchers at Albert Einstein College of Medicine found that hypothalamic inflammation is one of the fastest growing health issues, but it's difficult to measure because people aren't looking at their brain when they go in for a checkup. But they found that hypothalamic inflammation, which the hypothalamus is kind of like an internal thermostat for your metabolism. They found that people with hypothalamic inflammation was leading to more belly fat, and more belly fat was leading to more hypothalamic inflammation. These two things were becoming a vicious circle. So just looking at a couple of metrics and being able to pass a test is ignoring how dynamic and incredible we are, and that we can't just put ourselves into these pithy boxes. But one of the greatest gifts that we have is the ability to see ourselves, and because our body is giving us feedback on whether or not it's doing well, and if there's some kind of information that we can use to change our health for the better.
100%. I didn't know about that research, but the hypothalamus is in charge of all your hormones. It's basically the one that sends out a message to the thyroid stimulating hormone. We need more thyroid stimulating hormone. Go send it. It sends a message to the adrenals. We need more cortisol. So yeah, you have inflammation in the hypothalamus. I can see how that would make everything go awry pretty quickly.
And now with this being said, one of the other, again, kind of superficial metrics that has some merit for sure, and I don't want to miss this point. I'm checking this box for everybody. These things that we're talking about today, these are just a small aspect of what metabolic health could include or should include, right? But another one of these that's controversial is BMI, right? So body mass index. And this is the general classification. It varies, just doing some math, what's used to classify people on this spectrum from, quote, healthy to overweight to obesity to
Correct.
Severely obese.
And BMI has come under, even when I was a trainer at Equinox, we all already knew then that a bodybuilder is going to have very high BMI and very low body fat. And the BMI is not going to be an accurate measure of their health or their body composition. And very, very thin people, the same thing. On the extremes, BMI is terrible. It's just, it is a height weight table. Is all it is. And it doesn't talk about body composition, and it doesn't talk about hormonal health. It doesn't talk about any of that stuff. It's just literally a height and weight table and tells you where you are in the normal range. So and even these articles on metabolically healthy obese were saying, this raises questions about the accuracy of BMI. But we've known BMI is not worth very much I've known it for decades. I'm sure you have also.
Of course.
It's very questionable using that.
But with that being said, it's still going to be a smaller percentage of the population who is as they even mentioned, Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson type, right? Versus what again, just our outer appearance can give some indication of whether or not that body mass index is indicative of something unhealthy.
Yes and no. And there is a new category now, which is an actual thing. I looked it up on PubMed. It's called, what's the acronym? TOFI. Thin outside, fat inside. These are people and this is what a little bit scares me about the GLP drugs. You look perfectly fine. You're not overweight. Your doctor won't even need to worry about whether they can talk to you about this because you're just fine. But meanwhile, inside, and you see this with anorexics, by the way, I mean, they're thin as a rail, and it's all body fat inside. I mean, there's no muscle, and this is a very serious condition, and it is one of the problems in just looking at the outside and making decisions about what's going on the inside based on how you look.
Yeah,
and it's a way of looking at it that I don't think is very healthy, forgive the pun, either, for us as a society or for people individually. It isn't all about what you can see. It isn't all about whether you're thin enough to get into your clothes. It's also what is going on inside. And that's the thing that I think gets ignored when we concentrate too much on weight.
Yeah. I think our brains are synced up now. Because that's what I was going to get to next was that, yes, even our appearance can give us some data, but it's not the only data.
It's not the only data, and we tend to we weight it too much. We put too much stock in the physical appearance and not enough in what that is supposed to be showing us.
Another really great thing about the paper is pointing to this phenomenon that different ethnicities can actually gain weight in a healthier way, right? So folks that are venturing into being overweight or even into obesity, there's certain ethnicities where you're going to hit a big pothole a lot faster than other ethnicities.
Well, no, I mean you're 100% right. There are different ethnicities, and different ethnicities show up differently in different studies, and talking about that isn't racist, and it isn't, it's descriptive.
Yeah. In particular, they mentioned people of South Asian, East Asian, Chinese, Japanese descent tend to have metabolic complications at a lower BMI or body weight than other ancestries. So that showing up as metabolic derangement and poor metabolic health happens faster when they get out of balance. Versus we had on Dr. Ben Bickman, who's arguably one of the leading authorities.
Dude, he's one of my favorite people in the space. I love that guy. I never met him, but
this is what he shared with me.
Fantastic.
He was like, because he talked about this very thing that is this interesting phenomenon. As a matter of fact, here's what Dr. Ben Bickman had to say about actually measuring insulin and why this should be one of these factors with measuring metabolic health in this phenomenon of metabolically healthy obesity and why it's missing out on this metric of measuring insulin and how overstressing our fat cells damage our health.
What's so interesting about fat mass is that we focus on the mass of fat, but it's the size of the fat cell that matters most. So in other words, this explains why someone could go to the liposuction clinic and have immediately 20 pounds of fat removed from their body. And before they had this, they could go in and get every cardiometabolic marker measured, go in, get 20 pounds sucked out of their body of pure fat. And if metabolic health was purely a matter of the amount of fat a body had, you would think every marker must be improved. And yet not one is better. So following liposuction, not one single marker is improved because it's not the mass of fat that matters most. It's the size of each fat cell that matters most. And there's some fascinating differences across ethnicities. I, for example, did my postdoctoral fellowship. So after a PhD, if you want to become an academic scientist, you have to do a fellowship period. I did my fellowship with Duke Medical School in Singapore, this beautiful country in Southeast Asia. We love it. It's a second home. One of my kids was born there. We love Singapore. But Singapore was interested in understanding across the populations within Singapore, why is it that a chubby white guy is perfectly fine, and yet a chubby Chinese Singaporean already has fatty liver disease, he has hypertension, he has type 2 diabetes. And even though they have the exact same amount of fat on their bodies, just as a point of interest, if you want to be really fat, you want to be Caucasian. White people can handle the most amount of fat on their bodies. On the other end is Asians and South Asians or Asian Indian. They have the lowest tolerance for body fat. And that's because their fat cells get very big very early because they have generally fewer fat cells on the body. And so this brings me to the point then. What is it about the hypertrophic fat cell that matters so much? It's two things. First thing, and this will blow some minds, you cannot have a fat cell grow unless insulin is elevated. It is totally, completely, utterly impossible. Now, I know people want to say, oh, well, calories matter too. They do matter. But if you just take out that one single variable, if you deprive a fat cell of insulin, it cannot grow. 100% full stop. Take this as from a guy who literally grows fat cells in my lab all the time. In a human model, you even see this. If you have a person with type 1 diabetes, they can eat 10,000 calories in a day. And all they do is skip an insulin injection and they will be as skinny as they want. In fact, this is so well known to that diabetic that it's a known eating disorder. It's more of a hormone disorder. But if they just skip their insulin injection, they'll be as skinny as they want. It's a condition called diabulimia. You only eliminate one single variable, the insulin. They cannot not only grow fat, they can't even hold on to it. So as much as calories matter, and they do, insulin is an absolutely necessary signal to tell the fat cell to grow. And then the calories help fuel that growth. Now, that was a bit of a tangent, but so let's come back to the hypertrophic fat cell. So you have a fat cell that's getting, I promise it matters, because as the fat cell starts to get so big, it's like a water balloon that's getting to the point of maximum growth. And if you continue to put water in that balloon, it's going to pop. And so as insulin is high and there's sufficient calories to fuel the growth that the insulin wants the fat cell to undergo, the fat cell starts to tell insulin, you continue to make me grow but I can't grow anymore, so I'm going to stop listening to you. And so the fat cell that's grown so much becomes insulin resistant to stop growing. So it's a survival mechanism. The poor fat cell, it literally, if it continues to grow, the membrane cannot hold it together and it will start to fragment and literally start to pop, which will be very unhealthy, cause a lot of inflammation, and will be a messy process in that fat tissue to try to clean up. Very unhealthy. So the fat cell becomes insulin resistant to stop further growth. At the same time, as number two, as the fat cell gets bigger and bigger, it starts to get pushed further and further away from the capillaries, which is the main blood vessel where the blood is giving up its oxygen and giving up its nutrition to a cell and taking all of the waste products away from a cell. So if a cell is getting pushed too far from a capillary, it starts to suffocate. The technical term at the level of the cell is it starts to experience hypoxia. It becomes hypoxic. And if the cell doesn't get sufficient oxygen, once again, it will die. It will be a very messy process, and we don't want our cells to die, and the fat cell doesn't want to die. And so it starts leaking out these pro-inflammatory cytokines, this word I mentioned earlier. Some of those cytokines kind of act like a trail of breadcrumbs, where when the capillary senses those breadcrumbs, it can follow them back and start growing a new blood vessel to feed that suffocating fat cell. So the fat cell has another mechanism to ensure its own survival, to correct its hypoxia in this case. But in the process, it is now leaking all of these pro-inflammatory cytokines throughout the entire body, causing what we commonly call subclinical chronic inflammation. So it's not like their inflammation has reached the point of an autoimmune disease or a cold or flu, but it's higher than it should be in someone who's otherwise healthy. And it's all because of the hypertrophic fat cell. And so we have the high insulin and the insulin resistance as the fat cell tries to stop growing. And then we have the inflammation as the fat cell tries to correct its hypoxia, both of which just contribute to insulin resistance throughout the body. So I generally say the fat cell is the first domino to fall. And then when the fat cell becomes insulin resistant, it's promoting this insulin resistance to other tissues like the liver, like the muscle, like the brain, causing fatty liver disease, causing sarcopenia or wasting of the muscle, or causing Alzheimer's or migraines or depression in the case of the brain. My hope is that in some way I may have had some contribution, albeit modest, if only, to changing the clinical paradigm of metabolic health, and not excluding glucose-based markers, but just saying that's not the hero. That's not the main character. Glucose and any glucose-related marker like glycation of hemoglobin, HbA1c, it's the sidekick. It's the Robin to the Batman, and insulin is the main character here. It is the main metabolic marker. It absolutely matters most. Thankfully, it can be measured at every single blood test. We just have both what I consider to be a scientific and a historic precedent that has left it out. Those should not be barriers anymore. Any lab, anytime you're getting your blood drawn, you can ask that person, ask that physician, ask that nurse, the PA, whoever it is, say, hey, can you just check that box and measure my insulin too? They may not know why you want it measured, probably because they never were taught why it matters. You only know what you've been taught, but insulin is going to be the early signal. And this is why, if everyone who can, please get your fasting insulin measured. Once you have your fasting insulin, that alone has a diagnostic value. And then you can start to combine it with your glucose marker, and create a whole new marker called your HOMA, HOMA score, which itself becomes a very valuable marker of insulin resistance. So we have the technology, we have the means. At this point, it is purely a lack of education. But Shawn, what's funny, as much as we're talking about insulin resistance, most people still don't really appreciate it. Like when I wrote my first book, the reason I didn't call it "What is insulin resistance and why does it matter?" it's because I knew no one would buy it. Everyone looks at the word insulin and immediately just thinks diabetes. They don't realize the relevance of insulin in their own body, in their own life. And we've been talking about the fat cell and calories. Insulin does so much at throughout the entire body. That's why I thought I need a sexier name here. And so that was the birth of the Why We Get Sick title. But yeah, I mean, insulin is the marker that matters most. And the more we overlook it, the longer it's going to take us to actually determine the problems.
Ben Bickman, he wrote a book, Why We Get Sick. Mm-hmm. Did you talk about it in the book? First chapter, insulin resistance. He puts insulin resistance at the core of every major chronic disease. So I'm a huge fan of his because that's exactly what I think. Yeah. And he's a terrific.
Yeah, and he's doing the biopsies, he's studying this stuff, he's looking at it.
He's a smart guy.
And what that really means is, even as I'm saying this, in this kind of classification of us as humans, it's in some interesting way, it's like a resilience factor there against these environmental inputs to stay a little bit healthier, more functional, being this particular ethnicity versus these other ethnicities. But that can be looked at as you might have a better warning sign and quicker feedback, or like we can look at this in different ways and have different conversations about it. But the most important thing to understand is that for all of us in our world, no matter what our ethnicity is, it is the environment itself has changed dramatically. And when we see these alterations in our physical health, when we're starting to carry around excessive amounts of weight, when we're starting to have all these derangements in our biomarkers, we're getting all this feedback that something is awry. And what you're sharing today is that if we don't acknowledge and honor these things, we're a ticking time bomb. Now, what you shared, one of the biggest takeaways from today is your numbers could be right there on the borderline. It's the Olympic time right now, by the way. This can make the difference between a medal or no medal. But in this case, the medal is death. All right.
The medal is not one
so
you want to win.
We don't want to win this medal, but you're right there at the photo finish right before it. And you're just like, oh, well, you're fine. You're kind of close to being pre-diabetic, but everything's clear. Right.
People understand this better when you talk about blood pressure because everybody knows what that is. So we consider high blood pressure 140 over 90. What if you're 139 over 89? Dude, it's not digital. It's an analog continuum. So you can't just say, well, I don't have a high blood pressure diagnosis, but I'm 139 over 89. That's not good.
Yeah.
We have to look beyond those digital silos of diagnosis,
Absolutely. I want to talk about just a couple more things that were in this
Anything.
paper. Again, them illustrating what the fat cell can look like as it's accumulating more and more contents is this really interesting phenomenon of lipotoxicity, right?
Glad you mentioned that.
Yeah.
Yeah. So where do we store our toxins in the body? When you eat a lot of crap, when you eat food that's been sprayed, when you are exposed to the air in LA or Beijing, where do you think that goes? It goes to the fat cells. It is stored in the fat cells. When people lose weight, they often feel terrible. Why? Because the fat cells are releasing all those toxins. And that's just the way the human body does. It stores, it knows this stuff's not good. We got to get it out of circulation. I know. Give it to the fat cells. They'll take anything. And that's where we store our toxins. So yes, lipo means fat. Lipotoxicity is a real thing. And if you're carrying around tons of fat cells, you've probably got tons of toxins that have stored up in those fat cells over years of being exposed to them.
Yeah. And of course, what our fat cells start to produce, or our immune system in response, that toxicity, right, with the inflammatory cytokines and the like. Again, this is a result of our fat cells, which are they're incredibly intelligent and trying to, in a way, protect us and holding on to some of these things, keeping them out of circulation, storing excessive energy that we're taking in, trying to protect other organs. But as we're doing that, it's creating a toxicity. The fat cells themselves are creating a toxicity. And but just to hammer home this last point, because there's some other cool stuff I want to ask you about.
Okay.
What we were talking about earlier is, and I kind of like this classification of your personal fat threshold, right? So how much body fat you can healthfully accumulate without dipping into all of this dysfunction. And that's going to change from person to person.
And from decade to decade.
And with this being said, this speaks to how important it is to pay attention to you as a unique individual and not even buying into these labels, right? With this again, I think it's well intended in some ways,
Of course.
but also in other ways, it's very, very disempowering. So let's talk a little bit about that. Your personal fat threshold. What do you think about that?
It's a concept I have not heard before. I like that very much. I think I'm going to steal it and use it in my writing. It makes a lot of sense. It passes the smell test. I mean, I think we probably have personal thresholds for all kinds of metrics.
Exactly. Yeah.
And going back to the fat shaming thing, I mean, I have had the slogan "Beauty comes in all sizes" since I first wrote my first published thing in 1990, whatever it was. Beauty does come in all sizes. There's no question about shaming but we do have these individual variations, and it would behoove all of us to look at them and to, look at them honestly without judgment and see, what can I change here? What can I improve here? How can I do this a little bit better and reduce my risk? And it also has to do with how much do you love to be alive? If you have I will never forget that I once, back in 2004, I wrote a book called Living Low Carb. And I'm in the 4th edition, I had gotten a letter from someone. And I published the letter in the introduction. And the letter was, I will never forget it. She said, "It's great that you're telling me how to get rid of diabetes. And it's great that you're telling me what kinds of foods to eat for more energy. But I'm 63. I don't have any friends. I don't have any family. I don't really have any reason for living. Why should I do this?" I thought, there it is. If you don't have a reason for living, why do any of this? And if you do have a reason for living and you care about your life and the people in it, why not do everything you can to live as healthy as you can for as long as you can?
Yeah. All right. Now we're going to open up Pandora's box.
Okay.
All right. Because
I'm ready. I don't even know where you're going to go, but go.
I mean, it's a rapidly growing, pervasive solution, which I'm putting solution in quotations, major quotations.
Okay.
Huge quotations.
Got it.
The solution for improving our metabolic health, for weight loss, is semaglutide and all the relative drugs in this category.
The GLP-1 agonists.
And,
so to be clear, you're talking Ozempic, Wegovy, all that. Okay.
Yeah. Now, again, both of us being in this field, for me, this is year 21, and you've been in this field for
19
forever.
Yeah.
And, understanding everything has its place, and there is some value here. And the education is so severely lacking on this subject matter. And so I know that you have some insights here, because again, we're talking about today this growing classification, this terminology being used of metabolically healthy obese, right? And as you expand that, right, and you look at what are some solutions within that classification, semaglutide, right? So Ozempic being a potential solution if you're trying to achieve whatever biometric. Where do you stand with this? What do you think are some things that people need to know about?
Oh, there's a lot. And I always plug other people's books when I go on these shows. I don't know why I do, but there's a very good book on Ozempic that I think anyone considering using it ought to read. It's called The Magic Pill. And it's by a science journalist. And reading that book, I realized that this is a hard drug to come down hard on, black or white, good or bad. This drug really has some big positives, not the least of which is it curbs addictive behavior. Mice love to drink. They love alcohol. And if you give mice alcohol, they will just get as drunk as they can, and they roll around in the little cages, and they just do everything that a frat boy would do. I mean, they love alcohol. You give mice Ozempic or Wegovy, GLP-1 drugs, and they leave the alcohol alone. So that's a huge plus. That's a huge possibility for this drug. They change your cravings. They change your brain. They don't actually, the GLP-1 receptors, they're more in the brain than there are in the gut. It works a little bit in the gut. Mainly it works on the brain. on cravings and desire. And that brings us to one of the possible red flags with Ozempic. It may make you stop craving alcohol, and it may make you stop craving junk food. Does it also make you stop craving to finish your book, or to do a great podcast, or to do any of the other things we desire to do? We don't know. It may just blunt your desire. I mean, Prozac worked that way too, blunted your cravings for things, including sex. So we don't know what kind of effects that's going to have. That's just one of the many red flags. I am never happy about a drug you have to be on for the rest of your life. I always wonder about that. From my early days as a trainer at Equinox, and people would come in, I was doing nutrition counseling then, I didn't even know anything to speak of, and they'd come in with a yellow pad of lists of medications they're on. And they'd kind of hobble into the office, and they just looked fragile and frail. And I asked many of these people, has any doctor ever looked at all of these drugs and looked at, and they, no. The depression doctor gave me a drug for depression. The sleep doctor gave me a drug for sleep. And they're on all this multi-pharmacy of stuff. And I just believe, this is just that can't be good. You want to stay as far away as you can. I'm on drugs that I'll probably have to be on for the rest of my life. We'll talk about that in a minute. But you want to do that judiciously. You don't want to just keep throwing things in there. And every weight loss drug I've ever seen in my 30-something year career has wound up aftermarket having a lot of stuff wrong with it. Fen-phen. Anybody remember Fen-phen? That killed people. And everybody was talking about that the way they're talking about the GLP. I'm not saying it's the same thing. I'm saying there was Orlistat, which was all the rage for a while until they found out, it causes anal leakage. Well, it doesn't kill you, but it kills your social life. So, I mean, these things are often found out afterwards. And I am suspicious of a blockbuster drug that breaks out. Everybody's using it. Every Beverly Hills housewife is using it to lose 10 pounds. It was not invented for that or approved for that. And you got to be on it forever. And I worry about that. I worry about what it does to our brain, whether it makes us less passionate in general, as well as, calming the cravings for things we'd like to have our cravings calmed for. But what else does it do? And I don't like the year-long, you and I were talking offline about this. We have never met anybody who has weaned off it and not gained the weight back. Maybe they will exist. Maybe 10 years from now, we'll have lots of people who do that. But there's enough red flags for me to go, don't do this unless it's a real last resort. Now, in that book, he talks about obesity, and he gives the statistics, and he says, you've got to weigh these possible negatives with what it costs the human body to be 300 pounds. Right. So there is a case to be made for these drugs. I just think everybody's using them for vanity purposes, and I think it's the wrong message. And it reinforces the message of what we were talking about earlier, thin on the outside, fat on the inside. If you make everything be about the weight, you continue, and many people do this, they eat less of the crap they're eating now. They don't change their diet. They don't get enough protein, which we didn't even begin to talk about. The revised protein recommendations, Peter Attia says we should be getting 120 grams a day. The government says we should be getting 0.8 grams per kilogram. That's half a gram a day per pound.
Yeah.
That's 50 grams a day. That's ridiculous.
Yeah.
So we're not getting enough protein. We're not keeping our muscle, which is the organ of longevity. And we're not changing our diet. We're just eating less crap, less because we're not as hungry. But, if you eat less potato chips in McDonald's and you can maintain a thin body, that doesn't make you healthy. It certainly doesn't make you metabolically healthy. So I worry about all of those things with the GLP drugs.
Yeah. I mean, with our history with the pharmaceutical industry, it would be just in our best interest to be much more patient and take our time with these things. But again, it's become so pervasive, and I want to invite into the conversation, into the party, those who are utilizing these things or considering it as well, and not to villainize this.
Not at all.
Which is what you're already setting this up with the education, because you're not just saying what you're saying. The biggest study that we have to date, and this was published in Diabetes, Obesity, and Metabolism, peer-reviewed journal. And this was a randomized trial, and it included almost 2,000 individuals. And the conclusion of the study, putting folks on to semaglutide, 1 year, all right, 1 year after withdrawal. And by the way, it was very successful in helping with weight loss, very successful. 1 year after withdrawal of once weekly subcutaneous semaglutide and lifestyle intervention, participants regained 2/3 of their prior weight loss. And now the findings confirm the chronicity of obesity and suggest ongoing treatment is required to maintain improvements in weight and health. It has to be used forever. They're saying it's required. Now, again,
I'm aware.
I have a colleague of mine who is utilizing this right now to great success for herself. And she's in the process of working to wean herself off and sharing her story. Now, again, we get into this place of, do I need to, what if, because my identity has changed. This thing is very effective in helping me to get to where I want to get. And by the way, she's doing other things well for herself and taking care of herself. What happens psychologically if the weight starts to come back?
Well, I'm so glad you brought that up, because that is a huge consideration, and it's one that he talks about in the book. If you have used food all your life to modify mood and to deal with anxiety, and all of us do to some extent or another, and now all of a sudden you're thin, what happens to those that need to medicate your feelings with food? It just goes away? It doesn't just go away.
Now, if there's no consequence, there's no side effect of utilizing semaglutide, it can be considered the title of that book, the miracle pill.
The magic
right?
pill, yeah.
The magic pill, the magic.
Yeah, but
not even the miracle.
The subtitle of it is the amazing promise and the major red flags in this new drug. So he's very fair about it. I mean, like I said, there are good things this drug does. And for certain population, it may be a lifesaver.
Yeah.
You know?
But with that said, what we're looking at here is what are the potential downsides? And that's something for us to discuss, because, our framing could be, it's just a little peptide, it's just this and that.
No.
But what we're looking at here is a black box warning.
Yeah.
For example, with Ozempic, indicative of thyroid cancer, not in humans, just in lab animals, not in humans.
That's probably a little bit overstated. It's first of all, thyroid cancer is not that common. You have a low risk of that to begin with. Yeah. So if they raise the risk by 18%, and the risk is only 1% anyway, it's not a huge thing.
Right. And you have to weigh that with, what about the risk of cardiovascular disease due to the obesity, right?
Yes.
And so these are all things for you to be aware of in your own personal health equation, your own choice. Now, I'm bringing this up to say that's just one of the potentials. Obviously, the hotter story is all the gastrointestinal distress issues.
And the microbiome disruption, which we don't even know about yet.
Right. And these are the things, again, the long term. These are just the initial snapshot, first couple months of this drug being in circulation at this level, first couple of years. What are the long-term ramifications? We do not know. And so I would implore us to be much more cautious moving forward and paying attention to the data, keep an eye on things, and not necessarily utilizing ourselves as that experiment if we don't know. And with that being said, all the things that we do know, that we have access to, that we might not be utilizing, because what we have tended to do psychologically is find the next Band-Aid thing, the thing to cover
We're
up.
a Band-Aid society, man.
The thing to cover up our body's feedback, right? You just mentioned the psychological thing, right? But our body's feedback that I'm not addressing something. That's why my body is showing up in the way that it is. And so I'm going to Band-Aid this. This could be a psychological thing, and how I'm self-treating or self-soothing myself,
self-medicating,
right? And there's a deep psychological stressor that's hurting me, and now I'm just going to Band-Aid that because I went down a couple pant sizes, and I'm still underlying this. I'm still suffering, or again, it's indicative of there's some severe gastrointestinal issues with my microbiome. There could be all manner of feedback that our body's giving us, showing up as being overweight, as obese.
Yeah.
But I'm going to hit it with this blunt instrument, forget all that stuff. And while that alarm that's going on is still going off in the background, and when does that alarm become like, an atomic bomb, just blow up?
Agreed. And I just want to put this in there too. I'm on the faculty of the Functional Medicine Coaching Academy. So I teach people who are going to be health coaches in functional medicine. And I did a class there where I talked about Ozempic and said, this is going to be a game changer. It may look to you like this is going to change our practice. People are not going to come in for coaching if they can solve their weight problem. They're not that interested in metabolic health. That's never been a big pull. You go to people's pain points, and one of the biggest pain points is walking around with all that weight. And I don't want to minimize the desire to use this Band-Aid. And I haven't been obese. I've been very heavy, but I've never been obese. And I can imagine that would be, if I was offered something and the big pharma was telling me it's fine, it's not, I'd be very tempted. I get that. And I said to my class, what you may not realize is that this is not going to mean we don't have people to coach. It's going to mean if they do it right, we'll have more people to coach, because the people who are on it, and if one of the people who've done it, I'm no shaming, I get it, I understand the reason. You need more than ever coaching on how to change your diet, keep your muscle, do the lifestyle things that make you metabolically healthy, because you are no longer going to have the visible sign that something's wrong. You're going to look fine. But we need to impress on those people that healthy weight is not healthy metabolism. They're not. They may be, but they're not equivalent. Just because you've gotten your weight down does not mean that you've solved the problems of metabolic dysfunction that are going to lead to really bad things later on. And I always feel like I can talk about this with more authority because I'm going to be 78. So I have the luxury of saying, listen to me, I got 40 years on you. And this is what happens when you eat real food and you take care of yourself. You can live a life where you may have some things that need to be worked on or fixed, but you can basically wake up every day wide awake, as I do. I never use an alarm clock. I am never tired. Almost never tired.
I've been around you. That's facts.
Dude, I'm not tired. I don't get tired. I mean, and
I feel like you're in your terrible twos, Jonny. I'm just going to be 1,000.
I'm that annoying?
No, not that. You just got a lot of energy.
No, I do. I do. And
Yeah.
I worked hard on that.
Yeah.
On having that. And it's a natural byproduct of the things that we teach. And that's why I can look at 30-year-olds or 40-year-olds and say, I know what it's like towards the end of in the final chapters of this. And you can live that way in your 70s, in your 80s.
Yeah.
And play tennis and do all the things that I do. And I think that's important to know.
Yeah. Absolutely.
So working on these things, if you're on Ozempic, go to someone who can coach you on how to support that with the right diet. Keep your muscle, which is the organ of longevity, as we said, right? And very important. Get enough protein and do the lifestyle things that will support the new, thinner you and not just make you a thin shell in a metabolically unhealthy body.
Yeah, I love this framing. Thank you so much for sharing this, because, one of the things that was apparent in this, again, long run study with this is that as folks are regaining their weight, of course, their body composition is changing. They're actually accumulating more fat, higher body fat percentage. But this doesn't have to be the case. And this is where it's like more important. And we have colleagues who are also, again, this is something that's utilized in their practice, coupled with let's work to ensure that you're maintaining your muscle mass. And another glaring issue with, again, just jumping onto one of these drugs without a comprehensive understanding is a huge, huge, huge risk of all manner of nutrient deficiencies. And so in particular, those correlated with longevity, disease prevention. So again, you might be addressing one issue, but causing several others.
Absolutely.
Now, you just brought up something that I'm very grateful to be able to ask you about. And
Ask
I
away.
actually have this special little folder on my Instagram of real longevity and not theoretical, like people who are doing exceptional things in what we consider to be advanced ages, right?
Okay.
So I just shared just yesterday and saved it. A woman who is competing in Senior Olympics. She's 90 and she's doing all the events. It's basically, she's doing a version of a pole vault. She's doing the hurdle. She's doing all these different things. Now she's doing it in a different way, but she's literally running circles around people who are, 10, 20, 30, 40 years her junior, right? Yeah. And this is what's possible. And I love to be able to pay attention and really sit at the feet of people who can truly educate me. And you're one of those people,
Thank you.
I even though we don't talk as often as we want to, you're one of the people and the names that I bring up in conversations with somebody who inspires me.
Thank you.
And so with your 78th birthday right around the corner, for you, what is the number one thing that's indicative of longevity from your perspective?
Oh, I'm so glad you asked that question because I've been on a mission to get this out there as much as possible. So Peter Attia, who we both know, great doctor, who is kind of the country's longevity expert now, and he's also a mathematician and pretty obsessive about numbers. So he has been talking about a goal called the kick-ass 100-year-old. What would it take to be a kick-ass 100-year-old? What is a kick-ass 100-year-old? And he came up with a list of like 20 basic tasks that you'd be able to do. You'd be able to do a farmer's carry, which is where you basically carry 2 bags of something 50 feet. You'd be able to take a 20-pound suitcase and put it in the overhead compartment on an airline. I mean, normal functioning things, right? You would be able to do. Able to walk up half a mile, whatever it is without. And then he reverse engineers that. He goes, okay, well, we know we lose this much muscle every decade, and we know we lose this much balance. And so he comes up with this Excel spreadsheet of the things that you have to do in your 30s, 40s, 50s, so that the deterioration will be minimal and you'll be able to do the things that a kick-ass 100-year-old could do. Sounds great, right? So these people are doing, cold plunges, and they're doing the wind huff breathing things and climbing up mountains, shirtless in the frigid cold and all this stuff, all in the hopes of kind of, biohacking our system so that we will be able to function well at 100. It's a worthwhile goal. I get it. Researchers recently said, why don't we look at some kick-ass 100-year-olds who are already there? And let's find out what they do, right? Do they do cold plunges, and do they take 75 supplements like I do? What do they do? So they went to Sardinia. Sardinia is one of the 5 blue zones, and it happens to have the highest population of 100-year-old men in the world. Not 100-year-old men who are in assisted living, but that are shepherds that are, walking up the hills with their sheep and doing all these different, they're functioning. What do they do? What are the lessons learned from the people who are already doing this? And there were 3. They came away with 3 lessons. And it's a little tongue-in-cheek, but in those 3 lessons is the secret of life. Number 1, live where there's lots of stairs. Now, I don't know if you've ever seen pictures of Sardinia. You can't walk out of your house and go get a quart of milk without walking like a mile and a half up. It's all stairs and elevation. So basically that one is walk everywhere. Just walk, 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 walk. The second one was spend a lot of time around gentle animals. These guys were all shepherds. Well, think about that. You're out in nature, which is information coming into your head about balance and harmony and eternity and all of those things. And you're with these sweet, gentle animals. What do you think that does to your physiology? Yeah. Here was the 3rd lesson. And it was actually the number 1 thing with a bullet. Make your friends and family your number 1 priority. These were these are men who sit around on park benches in the afternoon and talk about their feelings. They laugh. They have big family dinners. If you go back to the Rosetto phenomena, this was a town in Pennsylvania, a hardscrabble town of immigrants where they worked in the mines, dude. They worked in the mines. It was the most dangerous job in the world. They were inhaling all this crap. They ate the worst food you could imagine, and they all smoked. And there was no heart disease in Rosetto. It's an interesting story how they found this out, and would take us too far afield. But they found that where's the heart disease? We don't know. So researchers descended on this town. And if you Google the Rosetto phenomena, you will read all about it. I'm not making this up. Fact check me. And what they found was they had the tightest knit community anybody had ever seen. They had Sunday dinners together. They gardened together. They did square dancing together. They didn't put the old people out to pasture. They made them elders. And this tight-knit community, they believe now, compensated for the worst diet, the worst lifestyle, smoking, and that alone was the major predictor of their health and their longevity. This is not just the blue zones. We have a study going on now. It's in its fourth generation. It's called the Happiness Study. And the guy that is now the fourth director of it is now making the rounds of podcasts. And he wrote a book about the findings of the Happiness Study.
Yeah, my guy, Waldinger.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
He's been sitting in that same chair.
Ah, perfect. I knew you'd be on top of this. So what did he find? Over 4 generations that have been followed since the 1930s, right? The number one predictor of long life and long health was what? Family and friends. So when I went back to doing one-on-one coaching, which I do now, or I do these sessions where we kind of do a kind of a strategy session, a kind of concierge strategy. I get all the disinformation out of their heads about cholesterol. They come a lot, wanting more information about that because the doctor wants to put them on a statin because they have a 206 total cholesterol. I get a lot of those people. And we kind of strategize. What I wind up telling most of them, and this is why they love coming to me, I think, because I leave them with this good news. They may have some metrics that are not so good on paper. They may have a risk factor or two. Maybe they have a high LP(a), which you can't even do anything about. It's a big risk factor. Maybe they have high cholesterol measured correctly and as particles. I tell them to think of all of their life as a health bank in which you can make deposits or withdrawals. You got a couple of risk factors, those are withdrawals. But I ask them about their family, and I ask them about their friends, and I ask them what they do, and they light up, and oh, my kids this, and oh, we do this, and we do fishing, and we go, every Sunday we do. I said, you are making the biggest and most important deposit in your health bank that you could make. And it dwarfs all the things you're worried about. So do more of that. And they always go, I never thought of it that way. Yeah, well, think of it that way. Because when I'm asked on podcasts all the time, you're 78, how do you do this? And I have one answer, and I give it all the time, my tennis group. We have a group of 20 people, kind of started during the pandemic. We're on a group text. We talk every day. A lot of us, we're in LA, a lot of them are performers, very successful. We go to see each other's performances. We do lunches. We do things, not all together, but different subgroups of it. And we are in social contact every day, and we play 5 days a week in Beaman Park. And that is why I'm 78 and this way. And I take 1 million vitamins. I really do. I mean, it's disgusting. I know you do too. We do all that stuff. We do our exercise. We get our sleep. We measure it with the Oura Ring. We do all that. But then if you ask me the number one thing, it's that. And that's what I think people don't talk enough about and don't realize enough about, especially the ones who've been shamed that they don't do anything healthy. Well, if you're doing that, you're doing something major healthy. And you need to know that and do more of it. And that's my message about that. That is the number one predictor.
Jonny, you are a wealth of information, but also a wealth of real experience. And, you cannot be duplicated, but, the things that you've accumulated over the years, the experience you can share with all of us and help to direct us into a place where, that's incredibly inspiring for me. I want a group like that, when I'm knocking on the door of 80 years old. And I just appreciate you so much. And people might have heard a couple of things that you brought up in passing because you've been here several times. This is our 4th episode. You're an elite,
Thank you.
In an esteemed class right now.
And believe me, I feel the honor and the appreciation.
If people are hearing you like, oh, what's this cholesterol? What is he saying? We've got a masterclass interview with you on that subject matter. We're going to put for people in the show notes.
Thank you.
And if there's anything else, where can people connect with you? What's a good place for people to get
I'm on
more?
Instagram at Jonny Bowden, and I actually answer all my emails, and I make my email well known. It's my name at Gmail, and I'm doing private coaching now, and I love doing it, consulting with a number of different natural products companies about getting wonderful products out there in the marketplace that really help people. And I love what I do. And if you want to reach me, just write to me or say hello on Instagram, and I will reply.
And what's your Instagram?
At Jonny Bowden.
There you go. I appreciate you so much.
No H in Jonny.
Right. It's the cool way. Jonny.
Yeah.
And again, I appreciate you so much for coming
Thank
hang
you,
out with
man.
us.
Thank you so much.
Hey, if you like this video, make sure to check out this video right here.
Type 2 diabetes is the insulin resistance that's gone so far that now it can't control the blood glucose very well. Glucose is important, but insulin is more important when it comes to being the early signal